All right, let me bring us to order. My name is Elizabeth Anderson, and I'm the Executive Director of the World Justice Project, and your host today for this discussion. The first in a series of events over the next 6 or so months around the World Justice Project's World Justice Challenge. This is a biennial competition that we host typically in person at our World Justice Forum in order to highlight, showcase, support, and proselytize effective rule of law solutions to different problems. This year, because of the pandemic, we have shifted, as all of us have in so many different ways, we've shifted the World Justice Challenge online and stretched it out over 6 months. Like all of you, we're seeing some silver linings in this emergency that we find ourselves in, this opportunity that we have to have a series of conversations and to engage a much broader audience in those conversations. So I'm delighted to convene you for the first in this series. The World Justice Challenge was just launched about a week ago, and we've seen a lot of interest in it from all over the world, and my colleagues will be posting more information in the chat stream about the competition, and we'll be happy to answer questions if you have them about them. But let me start with framing today's discussion a little bit and telling you a little bit more about the challenge. The coronavirus pandemic has struck us at a time in which we have seen declining rule of law globally for several years, and as measured by many different metrics and institutions, but for us, we keep a close eye on the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index, and there we see a quite striking trend of declining rule of law across many different countries. In fact, in our 2020 Rule of Law Index, every region of the world saw more countries declining in their index score than improving. We see particularly sharp declines in 3 areas: in constraints on government powers, in anti-corruption, and in fundamental rights. So that's the backdrop for the pandemic that we have seen developing over about 5 years. And then enter the pandemic, and we are seeing that it exacerbates exactly these same weaknesses in the rule of law, on constraints on government powers, on fundamental rights, anti-corruption, access to justice. And so as we were preparing to launch our World Justice Challenge this year, we decided that we needed to tackle this particular set of challenges that are presented by this emergency. And so the World Justice Challenge is being convened around a theme of advancing the rule of law in times of crisis, and with 4 sub-themes. And those sub-themes are accountable governance, fundamental rights, access to justice, and anti-corruption and open government. And those 4 themes, in each of those themes, we're inviting colleagues from around the world to share ideas, initiatives, best practices that are helping address the negative rule of law trends. What are the practices that are proving effective in this particular context? And where can we find hope and inspiration and ideas and know-how to build back better? So we will be exploring these topics in a series of webinars over the next several months in each of those streams. Today is Anti-Corruption and Open Government Day, and there will be additional webinars in the coming months. And we invite colleagues to submit their ideas and initiatives to the competition. We're particularly keen to see collaborations and innovations that can open our eyes to new approaches. We like to think about this as crowdsourcing solutions for the rule of law. So today, to really stimulate good ideas and applications around the topic of anti-corruption and open government, I'm really delighted to welcome a panel of colleagues, partners who are working on these issues day in, day out in international organizations, with reformers around the world, and with the private sector. They represent 3 institutions that are key partners of WJPs in this competition and more generally. We have with us really two experts on anti-corruption and two in the area of open government, though of course there's lots of overlap there, but we will hear in the anti-corruption area from Giulio Nessi, who is a policy analyst in the Public Sector Integrity Division at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where he focuses on public integrity and in particular on enforcement efforts. Further in the anti-corruption area, we'll hear from Marcus Funk of Perkins Coie law firm. Marcus is chair of Perkins white collar and investigations practice, and brings to that work long experience as a federal prosecutor and also working in the State Department. And in his private practice focuses on internal investigations, complex commercial litigation, white collar, criminal defense, corporate social responsibility, and supply chain compliance issues. So lots of insights to be brought to bear from that work. Turning then to the open government side of our agenda, we will hear from Tanu Basu, who is Deputy Director of the Thematic Policy Areas at the Open Government Partnership, where she focuses her efforts on mobilizing partnerships across country coalitions and to build partnerships with reformers in the areas of anti-corruption, open government, digitalization, and other tools that the open government partnership countries are bringing to this effort. So that will be Tanu's contribution, and then we will hear also from Dan Barr, who also hails from the Perkins Coie firm, where he is a partner in the Phoenix office with 30 years of litigation experience, particularly relevant for our discussion today in the area of constitutional rights, media freedom, access to information, and he represents media organizations, including the First Amendment Coalition of Arizona. So we will hear about the particular role of media from Dan. So with that introduction, let me just kick us off with a few questions to our panelists. We will discuss amongst ourselves some of the key problems that we see emerging in the area of anti-corruption and open government efforts in the context of the pandemic. And then we'll shift to solutions for a bit and open it up for discussion and questions from the audience. So I'm turning first to the issue of corruption. Let me start with you, Giulio, if I may. You've described different phases of the challenges that we're seeing in this context, and that there is an emergency phase that poses certain kinds of corruption challenges, and then a recovery phase. Tell us a little bit about that thinking and what the OECD in particular is seeing in each phase.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. We're very excited to be thematic partners for this World Justice Challenge, and of course to bring our views and perspective on these integrity issues, and hopefully to contribute to bring up some solutions, to these such challenging times. Indeed, since the beginning of pandemic, we have observed a number of challenges coming up. We have published a couple of policy notes already on these topics: public integrity, fraud, and one is coming up concerning the integrity related issues of lobbying. And in this work, in these last months, one distinction that we have indeed been observing is between those challenges related to the emergency effect of the crisis, and those who are more related to the recovery. In some cases, they overlaps, of course, because of course we see also the pandemic is also re-emerging in many countries. But in any case, this is an interesting angle to see what are the integrity challenges in this context. And with regards to the emergency phase, I think one of the key areas of attention of risk is the one of public procurement, which is of course not new in the field of integrity. It's always been considered one of the highest areas of risk for corruption and integrity more generally. But in the context of the pandemic, we see a number of risk factors that became evident also building on the previous health and humanitarian crisis. And the first risk factors is certainly the urgency that at some point became evident to procure a very large quantity of goods and services, especially in the health sector, that had to take place in a very limited time, and therefore there was a broad use of the emergency procurement procedures, which is of course legitimate and in order to ensure the effectiveness of the response. But at the same time, as early evidence shows, but also past experience with the other crises like the Hurricane Katrina, but also the Ebola outbreak in 2014-16, this experience showed that there are some risks, and that sometimes this procurement process they tend to be abused and not benefiting those most in needs. And at the same time, another dynamic that we observe with regards to the current pandemic is that we are all aware of at some point that there were a very limited availability of some goods in the market, and this created some peculiar dynamic according to which there was a risk of corrupt behavior from those who had to ensure to acquire these goods, and of course there were a context that created these opportunities. Moving on into the risk related to the economic recovery phase, I will mostly think of the ones concerning the accountability more generally, but in particular to the role of control and oversight, especially of the economic recovery packages that have been adopted by countries. And again, here the key factor, the urgency of having these packages and these resources reaching the beneficiaries led to, of course, implied also adapting or relaxing some of the control measures, and also simplifying some requirements, because of course the focus was to have these resources getting to the beneficiaries. And at the same time, we all know also with the limits to the movement and also the lockdown measures, another challenge was that some of the control, audit, and oversight institutions could not carry out their activities because they had to be suspended or postponed. And this also, of course, created these gaps, also created some rooms for some corruption risk. And lastly, I will mention a category of risk that I would say concerns both the emergency and the recovery phases. And that's concern the integrity of the decision-making process. In this context, I will mention just two examples. The first one concerns the new, let's say, the new institutional setting, sometimes the new administrative also dynamics that have changed also the way the private and the public actors interacted, and therefore, in some cases, the legal frameworks and the regulation were not always covering this kind of new interaction, and therefore, for example, the way the private stakeholders interacted with the public decision makers, it was not covered by for example, by the regulations on lobbying that is in place, and this also created some rooms for potential abuses by those who had more resources, for example, to navigate this complexity, or those who had better contacts to reach to the decision makers. And one second category of challenges concerns the emergence that we have seen in many countries of advisory and task forces, advisory committees, task forces that were, of course, assisting governments in very crucial decisions. And that's, of course, something fundamental to bring sometimes the expertise and the experience. But again, this creates some risks, especially, for example, if private sector representatives are part of these groups, and in some cases may unconsciously or not favor the interest of some companies or more broadly of an industry. And in fact, some information that has been already available and some also media reports highlighted some potential conflict of interest in those task forces. And again, maybe later on we'll see exactly what have been some of the measures that countries have taken to address this risk. But I will just conclude by highlighting this risk concerning the decision-making process, because they're particularly relevant and impactful, not only on the effectiveness of the measures that countries are discussing, especially in times of very limited resources, but also they potentially affect the trust in the government and in the action of the government, which as we all know, integrity is a determinant of trust, has a great impact on trust. And therefore any breaches in this very sensitive phase may have consequences also on the economic and democratic, let's say, consequence of these decisions.
Thank you very much for that kind of tour of the risk horizon for us. And this last point about trust is, I think, one we will thread will pick up because, of course, as you suggested, has implications for economics and politics. It also has implications for our effective response to the health crisis itself. And so I think that's really maybe at the heart of the matter. Marcus, let me turn to you and get the perspective from the private sector and your clients. Giulio has highlighted lots of risks. Are your clients encountering those risks, and how are they managing them? What are you seeing unfold in this pandemic context?
Yeah, sure thing, Betsy, and great to be with you all and have such a great group of panelists to present with. I think, what we're seeing on the private sector side is, and we all know life is basically one big resource allocation problem, and that's the same thing we're seeing on the government side and on the private sector side. So on the private sector side, as companies are struggling for survival, as companies are finding it increasingly difficult to visit their factories, visit their vendors, of course, there is a slackening, generally speaking, of some of the compliance functions and some of the compliance rigors, particularly among companies that are sort of on the small to medium size, that are already sort of getting into compliance and into anti-corruption efforts, very much with little leverage in most cases, unlike some of their large counterparts. And now they're finding that they're even more isolated, I think, both geographically and then again, also just from a very basic budgeting perspective. And of course, the flip side is, and the relevant flip side is that these resource allocations issues also do not leave governments untouched. In other words, like Giulio was saying, you have issues relating to the government's abilities to enforce and regulate. And so the government enforcers and regulators, and obviously this differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but as a general matter, many of them, particularly in the developing world, have just started in earnest fighting corruption. And Andrew Boutros and I wrote a book, Oxford Press book on From Bakshish to Bribery, or edited it, that talks extensively about the efforts around the world to try to ramp up, efforts to restrict corruption within companies, and to try to get government corruption under control. And so, I think the quick answer is that we're finding there are very practical challenges that companies are facing. There are very practical budgeting challenges that companies are facing. And again, the flip side is that the regulators and enforcers are also not quite as focused as they once were on these topics. And of course, as company supply chains become more complicated, and particularly as companies are unable to get items, get their products, get pieces, get their inputs from known vendors, people that they've worked with, they are now having to go to new countries, new jurisdictions, new factories that they don't know, and in most cases during the COVID crisis haven't visited. So it creates also a host of additional problems from an auditing perspective, again, from a compliance perspective, that affect both corruption, and then the lesser included of corruption is forced labor. In other words, you can't have forced labor without corruption, but you can have corruption without forced labor. So that's the other supply chain issue that we worry about a lot for our clients.
Great. So thinking about those resource constraints, both in the public sector and the private sector, I think it will be interesting to see whether we can identify solutions through the challenge that help us. do more with less, and find workarounds to ensure compliance, notwithstanding those constraints. Maybe technology is part of the solution. Maybe there are other kinds of innovations that you can share with us and we'll hear about through the challenge. Marcus, I want to, maybe thinking about technology and pivoting to an online world, ask you to describe what you're seeing in terms of impact on investigations or audit functions by the fact that we are all now living in these little boxes on computer screens and not able to do on-site investigations and compliance work that is so important in the anti-corruption area.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and a lot of white collar practitioners who are in this area talk about it quite a bit. I mean, my perception has been, on the one side, rather selfishly, you don't get quite as worn down by traveling. I mean, by now, October, I would have an easy 250,000 miles on my United Mileage Plus account, which I do not have now, as luck would have it. So in that sense, it becomes easier to, frankly, to do more different kind of investigations from your desktop rather than to fly to places. But I'll say that, first of all, from an auditing perspective, it is very difficult. I mean, it's hard enough to go into a factory, look around and try to figure out what's going on and who is doing what, particularly when people have an opportunity to try to clean things up, so to speak, from an accounting perspective and also from a personnel perspective. It becomes almost impossible to do it virtually because you can't just talk to someone in the hallway or stop them and ask questions in the way that you can when you're visiting. The same thing is true from an investigations perspective. We were kind of talking a little bit earlier before we started. Typically now my day begins at sort of 6 o'clock with interviews, witness interviews with people kind of all over the world. But where I find, and maybe this is sort of a perspective of a former prosecutor, but where I find a lot of the benefit, technical, see, someone doesn't like what I'm going to say now, but what I find a lot of the challenge should be is, I think you get a lot of benefit from just the human interaction, sitting with someone, small talk, building rapport, not being on an hour, kind of limit. And then also, again, the hallways. I mean, just sort of sitting outside with someone to say, hey, look, here's what we're trying to do. Like, don't take this the wrong way, but this is a pretty serious thing for you to answer, and you got to kind of think about what you're going to do. You don't have any opportunity to do that remotely. And so I think for the bigger investigations, the sort of non-routine investigations, where you want to eke out any benefit you can have, frankly, I think not being there in person is a bit of a detriment. And again, it's the whole picture, visiting the factory or the offices, talking to people sort of just randomly is where you learn a lot. So that's a kind of a long and maybe slightly imprecise way of answering your question. But I think the human touch, which we all talk about, the human touch, especially for people who are experienced in investigations, is missing in when you have someone just on a camera. And half the time they don't put the camera function on. And I found outside auditors actually ask about that. Did you have video or was it just audio? Because it makes a difference. And frankly, it was just yesterday, I had a big four outside auditor ask during a review of an investigation whether we conducted our interviews with the video on or not. So it's also a little practitioner's tip out there. But that's sort of my initial thoughts on that topic, which is a complicated one.
Yeah. Sure is. And maybe Dan will hear from you about data privacy issues that arise in this area as well when I come to you. But first, I want to turn to Tanu and pivot a little bit to the open government perspective on these challenges and hear from you what you see playing out in your agenda. The Open Government Partnership, I think, is celebrating its 10th anniversary, and we saw such great momentum building in that work over the last few years, more countries joining, making commitments, undertaking action plans. It's really been an exciting area. And then the pandemic hits. So what are you seeing and how that is setting back your agenda?
Thanks, Betsy, and it's really great to be part of this very important conversation and excited to partner with you on the challenge. Exactly as you said, Betsy, there is, while COVID-19 has really exacerbated some really existing structural challenges, there is no doubt that it has catalyzed the rollback of some really hard-fought victories in making governments open, more responsive. We've seen, exactly as you said, more countries joining, more countries, passing the Freedom of Information Act, opening up data. And while members of Open Government Partnership, which 78 countries and several local jurisdictions, are those that are committed to the open government and anti-corruption agenda, we have seen significant setbacks. Our research team has been tracking sort of what we call the state of open government, including data that our partners are collecting. There's the RTI rating that Access Info Europe and Center for Law and Democracy are tracking. There's of course the Rule of Law Index that you all track and others. And you mentioned some of these declining trends, Betsy, but I want to sort of go back to some of these and why they're so critical. On just availability of information, right? When you're talking about opening up government, the basic is that information available? And when we look at even data from this month, 1 in 5 OGP members have suspended or altered their RTI proceedings in response to the pandemic. And this means that RTI oversight agencies in some of these countries are no longer carrying out regular functions, which means that therefore this essential information that would be procured or available to civil society, journalists and others to keep governments accountable is not there. The second is, it's who exercises this oversight, and we heard that earlier from Julio as well, and you mentioned some of this. Again, data from this month, we've seen that legislative oversight is limited in about 7 OGP countries, which means that here the executive can rule by decree, and sometimes these decisions go unchecked. And the silver lining, if you're looking for one, is this number spiked significantly in June and has come down since. So which means that some of the governments are now setting time limits for their emergency measures. But overall, this trend is worrying because it shows how easy it is for executive power to be misused, since those legislators, audit agencies, ombudsman offices, and others that are critical to ensuring government oversight aren't able to anymore. And finally, I think, to talk about availability of information, who exercises oversight officially, but there is that wider ecosystem. And in the open government space, I think that's been so critical for us in OJP, the wider ecosystem outside the state that preserves and really protects this government accountability, seen some of the most worrying trends. Several governments have used the pandemic as a route to restrict space for civil society, underrepresented communities, and have been curbing media freedoms. So even now, so many months after the pandemic hit, about 10 OGP countries continue to restrict media freedom. And you said, Dan will talk more about it, hopefully, and we'll hear more. But 2 worrying trends, and that have worsened even just over the last few months, is the rise of state surveillance and the spread of disinformation. And this is not just in the global south, it is very much across the global north-south divide.
Okay, that's a sobering take on things. And again, those last issues that you mentioned around surveillance and privacy issues and like, I think go to, and misinformation go to the challenge this all poses to trust in institutions. Dan, we look to the media to hold institutions accountable, to get us good information. How is this affecting your clients and the media landscape more generally?
Well, unlike almost any other story covered by the media where it's covering what's happening to other people, the pandemic is happening to all of us. I mean, it's happening in their private lives as it's happening in ours. It's happening to their business as it's happening to any other business. The role of the media is to provide accurate information about what the government is doing. There are really 3 aspects of that. One is simply letting the public know in a neutral way what the government is doing, what public officials are saying, and all of that. The second is the watchdog function regarding corruption and malfeasance, and holding people to task. And ultimately is speaking truth to power, where you're holding up what the government says and saying this simply isn't true. I mean, for instance, we'll take the example of the United States. We have COVID spiking around the country right now, but the president of the United States says we've turned a corner. And so the media provides an essential function regarding, government credibility here.
And what are you seeing as some of the operational challenges facing the media as they play that role?
Well, I mean, that COVID has, like in all other parts of society, accelerated and exacerbated problems that already existed. So we all know the news media model is outdated and has been failing. It is a model that is based on advertising. And during the pandemic, the advertisers are either going out of business or have nothing to advertise, whether it be stores that are closed or events, or whether the music events or sporting events, or that none of that is happening. So there's no advertising. As a result, many newspapers around the world have closed. Many media organizations have reduced their staffs. And so that's put quite stress on things. And there's a relationship between money and safety here. Having less money means that you're unable to provide PPE to reporters covering stories in the field. It also means that throughout the world, there's more reliance upon freelancers. And these are people who don't have liable insurance. In many cases, they don't have health insurance. And in many cases, they don't have adequate PPE. And so you have in many parts of the world an inability to cover, let alone thoroughly cover, what is happening in those societies. I mean, and I can also talk to you about what, as a result of what some governments have done, sort of taking advantage of the media weakness here. You have instances like in Egypt, they expelled a reporter for The Guardian for reporting about a study in Lancet, which is, many know, is a well-known British science magazine. The government of Egypt claimed there were only 3 COVID cases in the country. And The Guardian reported that according to a study in Lancet, there were between 7,000 and 19,000 COVID cases in the country. Honduras has suspended its free speech guarantees. You have an instant, Iraq has expelled Reuters from the country for, again, reporting unwelcome information about COVID. In Mexico, you had journalists looking at death certificates to determine that the deaths from COVID were 3 times the amount that said by the government. And you have also examples of journalists being jailed. That's happened in China, where 4 journalists in Wuhan disappeared. 2 of them have reappeared. You have an incident in Serbia, where Serbia in late March passed a law saying that all information about COVID must come from the central government, and warning the news media not to use unofficial information. A few days later, a reporter wrote about conditions in hospitals in Novi Sad, which is a city in northern Serbia, about how they lacked PPE and the working conditions were dismal. Within hours, the reporter was arrested. Her computer and phone were seized, and she remained in custody for a couple of days. Eventually, the charges were dropped against her a month later, but the message was sent that we do not want the media to report anything other than the official version of what's happening with COVID in our society.
So we have an already vulnerable sector that is really increasingly threatened both by the economic context, the health context, and the political context in which they're operating. And that then undermines their ability to help us ensure open government and combat corruption. So that's a critical set of developments there. Lest we all despair from this first part of our discussion, I want to turn to the solutions and the workarounds and the effective practices that you see emerging in both efforts to combat corruption, ensure public integrity, and ensure open government and media freedom in this time. I want to make sure we have time for for our participants to ask questions too. So we're going to limit you all to about a minute and a half of sharing what you see as the most hopeful developments or approaches that you've seen around the world in the last 6 months, and then we'll open it up for questions. Let me go back in the same order and start with you, Giulio.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I will be very quick and just go straight to the challenges, to some recommendations and good practices related to the challenge I mentioned. With regards to the risk of integrity in public procurement, as you mentioned before, there is a great potential for the digital tools to ensure integrity and accountability. And again, in some cases, the e-procurement platform have been used in such a way, have been expanded in order to ensure this accountability role. And I could mention example from Colombia, but also from Lithuania, in Peru, and also recently also other example from Costa Rica and Paraguay, that all made efforts to bring and to publish all related information related to procurement, and this created a great accountability function. And at the same time, these portals also allow the control and audit, let's say, function to working remotely, because that's also a challenge that we have seen emerging. More generally, on the accountability of the recovery measures, we have seen emerging in some countries like New Zealand and the US, for example, the establishment of some committees or some bodies that exercise oversight. In New Zealand, there was a bipartisan parliamentary oversight committee, and in the United States, there is the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee that also produce a lot of information and really make accountable of the resources used and how they benefit to the citizens. And finally, with regards to the risk of influence or of undue influence in the decision-making process, we see more and more that countries provide guidance to the private sector and to those who want to take part in the decision-making process, as well as to the government, on how to deal with this new reality in relations to lobbying practice. And that's example, there are examples from the Office of the Commissioner of Lobbying of Canada, but also, for example, the Irish Department of Health published a specific guidance, ethical framework for decision-making in a pandemic, that provides values and guidelines with specific regard to how to carry out the decision-making process in these such challenging times. And finally, with regards to the task forces and advisory committee, we saw the risk of conflict of interest, of conflict of interest situation, which is, of course, is not new, but again, by bringing these some specific clauses in the recovery decision, for example, in the recovery acts, as well as by establishing some kind of code of conduct in this committee, this has proved to be some good practices that could be replicated around.
Great. An interesting question in my mind is, why are we seeing these good practices in some places and not in others? Is it a matter of political will? Is it a matter of technical know-how? Is it a matter of resources, as Marcus had suggested earlier? Because that, of course, will help us think about how do we promote these good practices in other places. But Marcus, let me hear your take on where's the hope?
Yeah, I think, I mean, look, we may not be rounding the corner right yet, but I'm pretty sure this is a transitory phase. I mean, this is not permanent. So we're going to get back to normal, and it may be a slightly new normal, but it'll be back to normal. And whenever we are back to normal, I think my advice is to remind people, and that's to remind governments that the hard fought, as Tono talked about, also the hard fought sort of gains in the fight against corruption are easily lost. And credibility is easily is a very rare and commodity that can be quickly evaporated. And when companies essentially ignore these issues for now, while they have other things to do, I think they run a real risk of eroding what they have fought for. In some cases, fought for hard. In some cases, pretend to be fighting for. But in any event, they should be reminded of that. And the flip side is, companies need to be reminded that there will be a price to pay for those that basically completely abdicate their responsibilities right now. And again, I'm lucky that I don't see that in our client base, but I know it's a risk. And so the C-suite, the management of companies, they need to be reminded that while they have other things they're worried about, they can't forget this topic, because if they do, they're going to pay a price, whether it's in 5 months or 2 years from now, both by the consumers who are going to be unhappy with companies that engage in conduct that undermines democratic sort of rules, as well as with the enforcers and regulators that are going to come and say, hey, why didn't you mind your shop more carefully? So I think those are the two prescriptions that I think we should keep in mind.
Great. Okay, Tanu, over to you. What do you see as emerging as most effective solutions in this context?
So hard to despair, isn't it? So when the pandemic first hit, OGP launched a campaign called Open Response and Open Recovery. Exactly as Julia said, there is a shorter term and a longer term sort of response we need to see. A few examples across, who's doing this well, a work in progress still. So some countries have really promoted greater transparency, including to proactively release data and raise awareness among citizens. And this has been critical to the sort of the citizen response to government regulations in a way. We saw this in Korea, South Korea, an OGP member, and also in Taiwan. We've also seen several local jurisdictions do this well, such as Buenos Aires city that proactively published all its data set it used to make decisions for its COVID-19 response. We've also seen countries, and I've seen a couple of questions in the chat about procurement. We've seen countries make available data on emergency procurement, like Portugal, there's Paraguay, there's Colombia, who sort of made available public expenditure data. And opening up this data allows for civil society and the public to monitor corruption, such as including tracking price differences for COVID-19 supply. So this is all in sort of the emergency response. In the longer term, this oversight will be critical for a number of things, mostly to monitor the massive amounts of stimulus and safety net packages that are being rolled out both by governments from their treasuries as well as international institutions like the IMF and World Bank. And some of these packages are possibly the biggest we've seen since World War II. So to strengthen some of the sort of longer term recovery and resilience, a couple of things I think that we're seeing that are being done well. One is they could, you asked what does it take? It's not just about reforms and technical reforms on the anti-corruption side. So it's just not about protecting oversight institutions, but also to create complementary mechanisms for public and civil society to monitor how and where this money is allocated for essential public services. Across OGP, of course, there are many examples, and happy to share those over chat and on Twitter later. But sort of South Cotabato in Philippines, Kaduna State in Nigeria, at the local level, we're really seeing this sort of use of tapping into the citizen oversight. Finally, I think it is the financial support that companies receive, and Marcus talked about that as part of the economic stimulus and safety net packages. It's important that it's not leaked, sort of rebuilds the domestic economy rather than being laundered to tax havens. In fact, Canada, Denmark, and France have refused to grant bailouts to companies based in tax havens. So transparency of who owns and controls these companies and ending shell companies is really important for that longer term effort. There are several countries who are starting reform in that area: Nigeria, Mexico, Armenia, the UK, but there is a long road ahead. The last thing really, and I realize we're sort of want to go into questions, one of the necessary conditions to tackle corruption is really the enabling environment for civil society and the media. And we've seen a couple of examples there. In Tunisia, the cabinet has pledged to provide funding for independent media outlets. In Afghanistan, the Ministry of Health is working with local community and civil society, including providing funding to enhance support for monitoring. So we really need to acknowledge that tackling this kind of corruption is not a technical fix, but it really needs to be strengthened through the complementary democratic institution and robust enabling environment for civil society.
Terrific. Well, that's a good segue to you, Dan, and additional specific ideas about enabling environment for the media in particular.
Sure. I mean, just as I said earlier, how COVID had accelerated change in the media, it was the bad news. It's also the good news, frankly. the days of the large metro dailies are disappearing throughout the world. And I think we're going to a media environment where there are going to be a few large national publications, but they're going to be mostly smaller, more nimble media outfits throughout the world. I think what the COVID has shown is that, for instance, you don't need large offices and you don't need the latest software to do something, that people have been doing more with less. It's also brought into consideration for all reporters, and not just investigative reporters, the importance of digital security. That you simply can't interview people on Zoom or use regular email a lot of the times because it isn't secure. So keeping sources confidential becomes increasingly important, and being wise about what platforms you use. For instance, I understand that Signal has become very important because it's encrypted in both ways. It's also an issue of wanting to do, how do you cover more issues? And one of the answers has been collaboration with media organizations, not only in your communities, but around the world. We've seen that with the Panama Papers and recently with the FinCEN papers, where you have 90 media organizations in 100 countries working together. And so I see that as, I don't know if it's a benefit, but as the world we've been going to anyway, where we're going to have smaller media organizations working collaboratively with each other.
Great. And I should say that that's something we're really hoping to see come forward in some of the World Justice Challenge applications. It are innovative, creative, effective collaborations and partnerships across sectors to solve some of these challenges. So encourage folks to think about that. I want to ask a couple of the questions that we've seen in the chat box, and there's a question about the particular vulnerability of workers in this time. And that's a broad topic, but there's a corruption angle as well. And maybe Marcus, you mentioned the challenges of modern day slavery and trafficking, and maybe you can reflect on what you see unfolding in the context of the pandemic for that challenge.
Yeah, Judge Virginia Kendall and I wrote a piece on sort of how COVID is impacting forced labor, which is traffic labor and indentured servitude and child labor, and et cetera, so modern day slavery. So if you're interested, check that out. I think the short answer is, and this is really common sense, right? Criminal organizations don't care as a general matter about the welfare of the people that they're exploiting. So now they have a perfect opportunity. There's a bit of a vacuum. The enforcers are no longer sort of knocking on the door as much. Frankly, they may not have to bribe them as much. I mean, there is no way of having a large scale trafficking operation within a factory, and we see those all over the world, but particularly in certain parts of the world, without bribery, right? You're always bribing immigration officials. You're always bribing inspectors. So now you have a combination of things. You have reduced enforcement, and you have greater needs because companies aren't asking as many questions sometimes when they're looking for product. And so, and like I said earlier, in many cases, they're now working with new vendors. So it's sort of a perfect storm for criminal organizations that are abusing and exploiting human beings for their own good. And so, I think the short answer, not to be too pessimistic about this, is that there's a lot of observation about what's going on in the world, and there are a lot of people monitoring. But I think action is required. And I think, again, if we think about all of the laws we have on the books, the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act, the UK Modern Slavery Act, all those things are all very nice. They make people feel good, but there's zero enforcement in any meaningful sense. I mean, there's substantively zero enforcement on both of those, and a whole host of other laws are all around the world. So, I'm always in an environment where people talk about, should we have new laws? And I'm frankly always involved in sort of drafting committees and similar undertakings. But my general message is we don't need more laws. We need to act, and we don't need more papers, frankly. We need people to enforce the very basic laws that are on the books already. And I think the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act is a good example. It's descriptive law, right? It's not proscriptive. It just says you have to describe what you're doing. But there's been no enforcement for companies that haven't done it, which, you know, is, if you care about that law, is a problem. And the same thing is true for the UK Modern Slavery Act. Lots written about it, very little action by the Home Office. So again, not to be sort of a downer on this, but I just think you have to be realistic. And maybe that was my biggest frustration when I spent some time with the State Department is, you know, action versus words. There's just there's a disjunct sometimes in some circles. And so that would be my, it's not so much a prescription for the future, but I think my greatest concern is that these organizations are using this historic opportunity to further entrench themselves. I mean, criminal organizations.
Well, that's a challenge for our World Justice Challenge participants is help us crack that nut and figure out how we can get from words on paper to implementation and enforcement. Let me maybe wrap up with one question I really want to put to all of you and to reflect on and to say any concluding remarks, which is coming back to this question of there are kind of islands of integrity and some best practices that we see around the world. Some of you flagged them. How do we proselytize those? That's certainly what we're trying to do in the World Justice Challenge, to lift them up, to give them profile, give them resources. But what other strategies do you have for encouraging uptake? Whether is it political will, is it technical assistance, is it resources that countries need and other actors need to take up some of these best practices? And what do you advise on that? Let me, I'm going to go in reverse order. Dan, you get to go first.
Okay, sure. Well, I guess I have an easy response. I mean, I think the pandemic has shown more than anything the value of having accurate and timely information about the disease and its spread in the community. People, I mean, unlike a lot of things in the news where people are reading things that they agree with or disagree with or makes them feel good or makes them feel bad, people are making decisions about, should I send my kid to school? I mean, do I need, you know, PPE to do various things? Can I have people over at my house and all of that? And so having accurate and timely information about the COVID pandemic has become vital. And it's sort of stripped away, I think, for some, the need to feel pleased or outraged by what they watch on TV, and they're looking more for solid information.
Okay, let me go next to Tanu.
Yeah, I think one thing that we've definitely learned is no one group has all the answers. Government certainly doesn't have all the answers. You know, private sector doesn't have all the answers. So even as our partners think about the challenge, where can there be that cross-sector collaboration to make that sustainable? So government with civil society, with private sector, with the media, where can there be this collaborative projects? I think that is a really important way to make sure that that's sustainable and it's sort of spread. The second is, I think, you know, you reference it, but very quickly, technology alone is not the answer. Like there's just it's just too tempting. Just say we have an app and we'll put it out there and that's it, that, you know, our problem solved, we can all go back home. That certainly isn't it. Is the technology is only as good as you know, the people who operate it and who built it and who designed it and who will monitor it. So I think technology with monitoring, with the people element to it is incredibly important. And that is something that will really help sustain some of this.
Okay, great. Marcus.
I think kind of pursuing modest objectives and taking baby steps is very important. In other words, instead of some of the sort of, again, this is really something governments do with grand pronouncements and grand initiatives, but then no follow-up. So that's sort of just repeating in a way what I said earlier. I mean, I think the creditworthiness and of the justice systems all around the world is limited. It can be quickly eroded, and whether that's through media reports or through bad actions or a combination thereof. And so procedural justice, right, making sure that you are actually earning the trust of your people is key. And so I think actually, if you want to have a culture of compliance in a company or in a government, I think you have to actually lead by example. So baby steps, and actual practical follow through. To me, if there's one thing I've observed in my time in this field, is that's the one thing that's key, and that's the one thing that's often unfortunately missing.
Great. I think that's really apt. And I say in my own work in this area, I've looked a lot to the OGP and to the OECD and the resources that your organizations have been generating to provide that a roadmap of the incremental steps that different actors can take again to chip away at these challenges. Julia, you want the last word?
Yes, and maybe just to recap on the points that have been already mentioned, I would just also building on the OECD recommendation on public integrity that stresses these issues. So there are, let's say, already existing solutions. I would say that the importance is focus on a strategy, having a strategy to address the various risks, both the pre-existing ones and the new ones that have been emerging. Also having a coordinated response, and that's something that also goes beyond the emergency and is an issue, a challenge that many countries have been facing even before the crisis, because many institutions are part of an integrity and anti-corruption system. And lastly, it was mentioned already, also this point, the importance of the human factors. I mean, that's where it all starts from. We see more and more the efforts to build a culture of integrity in public organizations, and starting from there, and starting from building this kind of common sense in public organization is preconditions also to better address the new challenges, but also the ones that already emerged before.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We are coming to the top of the hour, so I'm going to bring our discussion to a close. But I hope it will stimulate lots of follow-on conversations among participants and beyond. I encourage viewers to look at the WJP website, learn about the World Justice Challenge, participate in the challenge, participate in the series of webinars, both thematic and then regional, that we will be undertaking over the next 6 months to showcase really effective solutions to the very significant challenges that we are seeing in the context of the pandemic. I want to say a special thank you to the participants in this panel discussion for sharing your expertise and ideas and inspiration to this effort, and to your institutions, the OGP, the OECD, and Perkins Coie Law Firm for your partnership with WJP in the World Justice Challenge. So thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to crowdsourcing lots of ideas out of this discussion.
Thanks, Betsy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, all.